Welcome, everybody, to Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, the author of Writing That Gets Noticed, Find Your Voice, Become a Better Storyteller, Get Published, and it is now a course at NYU and an elective towards the journalism certificate. Every week, I speak with novelists, with authors, with writers of every niche to talk about their tips, their tricks, their strategies, and how the sauce is made, including creative advice. I'll talk about essays and articles and share my own experience from 3 decades of publishing. So join me every week and grow your business and build your craft with Freelance Writing Direct. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes, and follow along on Substack, where I share special clips for subscribers only at estelleserasmus.substack.com. Hi, everybody. This is Estelle Erasmus, the host of Freelance Writing Direct and author of Writing That Gets Noticed. And today I am so happy to have Sue William Silverman with us. And for those who are watching on YouTube, I'm holding up her book, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Sue. Sue William Silverman is an award-winning author of 8 works of nonfiction and poetry. Her most recent book is Acetylene Torch Songs, Writing True Stories to Ignite the Soul. Her previous book, How to Survive Death and Other Inconveniences, won the Gold Star in Foreword Reviews Indie Book of the Year Award and the Clara Johnson Award for Women's Literature. Other works include Lovesick, one woman's journey through sexual addiction, made into a Lifetime TV movie, Because I Remember Terror, Father, I Remember You, which won the AWP Award, and the Pat Boone Fan Club, My Life as a White Anglo-Saxon Jew. She is faculty co-chair in the MFA in Writing program at Vermont College of Fine Arts, and I'm going to put in the show notes where you can reach her on her website, SueWilliamSilverman.com. Welcome, Sue, to the program.
Thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to meet you, and it's great to be here, so thank you.
It is so great to meet you. I've been a fan. We're both at AWP. It just became a busy time, but we didn't get to meet in person, but I made sure that you were going to be speaking on the program because I just adore your new craft book. And let's get into it right away. Acetylene Torch Songs. Okay, the title, tell me. How did you decide on the title? It's fascinating because acetylene is a flammable gas that just makes things explode. So talk to me about that. It's perfect.
Right. And that's sort of what we want to do with our personal narratives, is sort of have them kind of explode on the page. And even if your story maybe isn't, like headline worthy or something, it still needs to be very precise and very vivid. And so the idea of Acetylene Torch Song, or the word acetylene in particular, is that idea of getting sort of writing from your soul and just letting it kind of explode in these fiery, visual, vivid ways onto the page. And a torch song, for those who don't know, it's a kind of music that was popular back maybe in the 40s, I think, where people sung their hearts out, all their angst and their losses and everything. So it's a form of music. But that also sort of ties into creative nonfiction, where that is what we're doing. I mean, sort of regardless of what your story, you are sort of putting it out there and you're making it, you want it to be sort of gripping and moving. So just these words kind of came together, and that's how the
I love it. I love words, and I collect words and see if they work with my writing. And so I learned some new words in your book. I learned lacuna, which is the gap in memory. And I thought that was so interesting. There's so much I want to talk to you about. You talk about excavating memories and making stories out of them, Sue, and you do such a beautiful job. Can you just very succinctly share some of the steps that you go into far greater depth in the book about excavating memory?
Sure, absolutely. You know, a lot of us, we sort of remember some things, but sometimes the thoughts are kind of vague and we're not sure. For me, the best way and the most direct way, really, is to sort of let myself sink down into the senses of the moment. Because for me, if I can remember how something sort of smelled like, or tasted like, or just felt like, then the memory becomes clearer and clearer. But that only happens in the writing process. Like if I'm just sort of sitting around thinking, oh, what was that like? My brain is kind of blank actually. But when I'm writing and I really push myself in a sensory way, getting those sensory details, that's when more and more the memory comes into play. And I'm always astonished by what I can excavate when I really just embed myself within that sensory experience.
You know, I'm so glad we're talking about this because so many writers will say to me, oh my God, how can I remember the exact conversation I had with my sister when I was 8 years old? But it's so tantamount to me telling the story. And it's like, yes, no one can even know or recreate unless there was a tape recorder in the room. And that is unlikely. So you're going to have to figure out an approximation. And that brings me to dialogue, which you talk about in the book also. And it's something that is something important to me as well, because so many people use dialogue incorrectly. And you say in the book that it needs to move the story forward. It needs to kind of be part of the action or the inciting incident. It needs to show, I love this word, the interiority. You know, I'm a consumer writer. I'm not I've written literary, and I love the word interiority. It's really what's the inner workings going on, and that's what the dialogue should show. So what are some of the mistakes, because you teach and you've worked with so many writers, what are the common mistakes you see people using when it comes to writing dialogue?
I would say the most common mistake is, well, first of all, just to know that nobody can remember a conversation that you even had yesterday, let alone 10 years ago. So don't even worry about that, because you do have an approximation of the kinds of things somebody said, you know, the way they said it, and that's good enough. That said, dialogue, the less is better, less is more when it comes to dialogue. And you really just, let's say a conversation goes on for an hour or something with somebody, you probably could get maybe 4 lines of dialogue that would sort of highlight that. But then what you want to do, which I think is more effective, is rather than just pages after dialogue, I'm going to recreate something with you. I would say Estelle went on to say, and then basically I sort of summarize the dialogue, but I also sort of interpret it. And by doing that interpretation of how I sort of felt about the dialogue, then the reader gets to know more about me, because it's sort of I'm channeling the dialogue through me. And why do we read memoir? To learn about the narrator, right? And so basically what the reader really wants to know is, well, Sue, how did you feel about that conversation? How did you interpret it? So rather than just trying to recreate, Estelle said blank, 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 if I just channel it through me, then the reader would know my feelings towards it, and by association, sort of my feelings towards you, or whoever I'm writing about. And so that is much more effective way to convey a conversation.
And what I love that you did in the book, which I do in my book also, is you broke it down and showed why something worked and why something was effective. And you did something else that I do not see in other craft books, and I've read a lot of craft books. You wrote pieces specifically for chapters in the book. And Sue, that's very impressive. I love that you did that. I did that a little bit in like one little tidbit for my book, but you wrote a whole hermit crab essay, in fact. And I think that's wonderful that in the service to your craft, you did that. So
Thank you.
talk to me about that a little bit. Those
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the book initially did not have those. It's sort of, everything's a process, right? So
yeah.
I'm in the middle of writing this book, and it suddenly occurred to me, I'm offering this advice. Is it accurate? I mean, will it work? Does it make sense? And could I follow my own advice? And I thought, well, I think I should try. And so, yes, so for each chapter, I wrote a personal essay that does sort of speak to or highlight the concerns of that chapter, because I did want to make sure that the advice I was offering made sense, could be followed, all of that. And at times, so after I would finish the personal essay, then I would go back and sort of tweak the chapter a little bit to clarify things, which then would result in my tweaking the personal essay. I would sort of go back and forth until everything sort of aligned. But I did feel that it was important. And as it turns out, it was a really interesting exercise for me as well, to really know that I could sort of write with intention in that way and really follow, well, okay, so this chapter on voice is telling me that I need this aware and this unaware voice to sort of fully realize the narrator. How do I do that? And if I really am intentionally writing for that specific, craft element, then I could really explain it more clearly to the reader.
And can you break down a little bit more unaware and aware voice? I thought that was a really interesting concept that I hadn't heard about before, but it makes perfect sense if you're writing about when you're in a certain state, maybe from childhood or before you've realized life, and then the reflection element, which is obviously the older, the wiser, because otherwise, what is the reader going to learn from it?
Yeah, exactly. So right. So we have the sort of the big concept of voice in creative nonfiction, or fiction too, for that matter. But within this sort of big umbrella of voice, I broke it down into sort of two voices that basically every memoir or personal essay needs, which is, one is the unaware voice, and the second is the aware voice. So the unaware voice is the voice that is actually represents in the moment that this happened to me. So basically, that voice would be relating the surface story, like this happened to me, and then this next thing happened to me, and then this next thing happened to me. So it doesn't have a lot of insider knowledge. It's telling the reader the basic story of what happened. But if that's all it is, then that's boring. Like, this happened to me, like, big deal. Okay, so what? So the reason why I write creative nonfiction is to understand what that happening meant, what it means. And that's really why somebody would read a memoir, like, well, what did all of this mean? What's the metaphor of that experience? So that's where the aware voice then comes in. The aware voice is basically me, the author narrator, in the moment, sitting here in front of my computer, writing with all that omniscience and all that awareness of what did happen in the past, and figuring it out on the page as you write, of course. So, like, what was the metaphor of that experience? Looking back on it now, what did that mean to me? So it's not just remembering an event, it's making sense of an event. And that's what the aware voice does. It makes sense of an event that happened in the past.
No, that's brilliant, because I'm a big fan of Vivian Gornick, The Situation and the Story. And she talks about the situation, which is the external, sort of like writing a diary entry. If you go back to 16-year-old Estelle, we went bowling. I had French fries. I wore my blue denim jumpsuit. And it's like, okay. And the story, which is the emotional implication. So maybe when I was at the bowling alley, I saw a guy I liked, but he said something and it reminded me of something my dad said to me that made me feel a little insecure, or that made me feel good. And so there you're getting that. That's a little bit different, because it's not the aware and unaware. It's sort of like, it's just adding that level. But I think when you say the aware, the unaware, it's another tool in the toolkit that I really like.
Thank you. Yes. And it's really is crucial. And that aware voice is something that I think a lot of beginning writers struggle with. It's just practice, like anything else. And And it's also the other thing that I think can be misunderstood is it's not like the first half of your book or the first half of your essay is the unaware voice. And then all of a sudden the aware voice jumps in to make sense of it all. It's much more fluid than that. In that, like in one paragraph, you can have the two voices sort of intermingling with each other. Like the unaware voice would sort of say, well, this happened just now. And then the aware voice would sort of weave itself in as gracefully and subtly as possible to sort of reflect on what that moment meant.
That's great. And you even give examples in the book of like a draft of your own. And you say you were trying to write a braided essay and you were very open and honest. You're like, this isn't working here. This isn't interwoven. This needs a bit more tie-in. And I thought that's great because people who are maybe starting out or haven't done a braided essay, it's just, you're right there in the trenches with them, Sue. And I think that's what's so wonderful about this book. And, as somebody who's been a magazine editor-in-chief and somebody who's been in publishing for 3 decades, I see when there's heart behind something, and I see when somebody is really focused on service. And in this book, you're focused on service because not only do you break everything down? Do you give your own examples? Do you give examples from your life and explain why something works? Do you share new concepts? But you also have an addendum where, my goodness, you share how to write a book proposal, which is just wonderful, and lots of tools and tips and other pieces of advice that just showed me like you really want to serve the reader. And I'm a huge admirer of that.
Thank you so much. Yes, that really was my intent. And for not to sound like, like I'm an academic and I have all the answers and this is how you have to do it. That's not the voice of this book, nor, I mean, and that's not me. That's not who I am when I teach. It's really, as writers, we're all struggling. We're always learning. And so we are all in the trenches together, figuring this stuff out. And so I wanted to be sort of like a friendly kind of a guide, but also just, there with you as we kind of do figure these things out.
Now, Sue, you've written memoir. You wrote some difficult subjects, right? You wrote about as you put it, your father's misuse of you as a child. You've written about your own sex addiction. You've written about the haunting or the obsession with Pat Boone, because he was sort of like a father, like an alternative in your mind, father figure, even though he wasn't Jewish, he was Christian. And so you've written these subjects that are, as an editor who I've spoken with a lot, Noah Michelson says that, could be considered clickbait, but you do it with depth and with reflection and with more than just that. What about the person who wants to write their story, but they don't have those kind of topics? They weren't an addict in some form, like other memoirs. They weren't a stripper. They weren't, having 3 ways with their next door neighbors, right? Is there a market for those books, right? Like I had a traditional background. My dad was pretty good. My mom was good. But I was in magazines like in the 90s in the glory days, and I was coming up and learned a lot. And I want to write a memoir about that, and also about finding my value as a woman who was the dating diva and spoke about dating while single. So, is there markets for those kind of books?
Absolutely. Just absolutely. Yes. Because everybody's narrative is important. I mean, you don't have to have like this headline worthy events happen to you. And some of the essays that I write are very quiet, like in How to Survive Death and Other Inconveniences. There are essays in that are about quiet things. The issue, what we have to do, and why everybody's story is important, is if you can access that aware voice, and that's when you're really writing your soul onto the page, then your story becomes art. And it doesn't matter what the subject matter is. It just doesn't. If you have an obsession about something, you really care about something, you really have to write about something, that desire will show on the page. Because if you are obsessed with something, then I'm going to be obsessed with what you're obsessed with. I'm a very obsessed person, but that's good for a writer because that's what we really do. But, I've been an editor at literary journals, and I once got an essay. It was called Dirt. This was a long time ago, and it's about growing up on a farm. I am so not into dirt or farming. I mean, I can't tell you. I mean, this is like a cashmere sweater, I don't do dirt and farming. So I thought, oh God, it's going to be boring. Well, it was fascinating because the author, she was obsessed with this farm and growing up on this farm. She brought me inside her experience. So if you bring me inside your experience, whatever it is, then I'm going to, maybe I won't be as obsessed with it as you are, which is as it should be, but I will really care. No, I didn't go out, move to a farm, but she really made me care about her life on a farm. So that's what it is. It's like whatever your obsession is, whatever your narrative is, if you feel strongly about it and have that strong desire to write about it, and if you write with that unaware voice and mingled with the aware voice, then I am inside the experience and then I care. And it can be absolutely about anything.
I really like that. And there was something else you say in the book that really struck me as so important. So I teach micro memoir, and you were saying go for the small moments. And that's very important with micro memoir and with essays in general. If you can go for those small moments, and you gave a visual example about, I think it was showing the effects of war. And you said what showed was the visual was the shoes, everyone's shoes, and that's what hit home. And so can you give the comparison to like how that would work with an essay?
Yeah, absolutely. So in Lovesick, for example, I write about this man with whom I had an affair. So I was a college freshman and he was a man old enough to be my father. And we had an affair, and he had this maroon cashmere scarf, and I wanted this maroon cashmere scarf. And after he brought me home one night, I took it or he gave it to me, I don't know. And so this maroon cashmere scarf, I described it, and it really became sort of the metaphor for the affair. And it's just a few.
So that's
sentences.
An objective correlative, right? So that's an object that's kind of standing. And Ann Hood, who's been on my show, does that wonderfully. William Dameron, who wrote A Modern Love and many other essays that I break down in my book, he does that. And so, yeah, go on about what that is.
Yeah. So, okay. So I'm back in my dorm room. I'm by myself now. I have this maroon scarf, and I press the scarf against my nose and mouth. I take a deep breath. The scent is of him, leaves smoldering in autumn dusk. And I believe it is a scent I've always craved, one I will always want. I don't understand why the scent of this scarf seems more knowable, more definite, more tangible than the rest of him. So basically, I'm taking this one small item, this maroon scarf, and using it as a metaphor to really stand for this whole affair. And because I can't have the man. I mean, I'm a college freshman. He's old enough to be my father. He's married. He doesn't love me. I mean, it's just obviously not going to work. This is not going to work out. So I can't have the man, but I can have the scarf. So this scarf, this is the aware voice and the unaware voice. It starts with the unaware voice. I press a scarf against my nose and mouth. I take a deep breath. That's just what happened. That's the unaware voice. And then it goes into the aware voice. The scent is of him, leaves smoldering in autumn dusk. And I believe it is a scent I've always craved. And then, why is this more knowable, more definite than the rest of him? Now, when that actually happened, did I have any of those thoughts of that aware voice? No. I'm this lost college freshman. I don't know anything. So the aware voice, then after the unaware voice presents the narrator just inhaling the scent of the scarf, the aware voice then comes in with the metaphor of the leaves smoldering in dusk. And this is going to scent that I've always craved and what I will always want. It's more knowable than the man. So that's the one small detail that's sort of metaphoric or emblematic of the whole affair. And it's an example of the unaware voice interacting with the aware voice. It makes sense of this maroon scarf.
I love that. I love that example. And it's really so clear. And you also talk about endings, which is so great. And you talk about the idea that, some people just want to end their essay with, and that's why I felt the way that I did, just kind of summarizing it. And that's just so not the way to do it. And you said that often you can end with an image or a metaphor. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because that's really, I think it's a number one mistake that I see students make.
Yeah, I mean, your endings, you don't want like a neat summing up or like this is what it all meant, because that's, sort of
That's
boring.
high school, right?
Yeah, but basically, if you can end with a sensory image that's sort of metaphoric, that adds a deeper layer of what this episode, this event, this memory meant, that's going to be a much stronger ending, like something that is from the senses, that's a scent or something that you see or something you feel or taste, something that has texture to it. If you can come up with an image that has that sensory texture, and then through the aware voice, deepen it so that there is, you don't have to have like a great epiphany at the end, but even just like a little moment of epiphany that does bring the reader and you as narrator to a deeper understanding of that memory or event, then that image, we tend to remember images more than we're going to remember some abstract summing up sentence. We just, because it's textured, like we'll remember how it smelled as well. Let's say we end on the scent of lilacs or something, if that's part of the story. You're going to remember that scent of the lilacs, or you're going to remember that scent of the maroon cashmere scarf of leaves smoldering. I mean, these textured moments, that's really what stays with us.
So people really need to pay attention to their environment when they're writing these memories or these stories, and the senses, the touch, taste, hear, smell, all of that will evoke more of the interiority of the verse. I love that word. And bring that out in the story.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, metaphors aren't something that's sort of floating outside and hoping that they sort of land on you. A metaphor is going to be some sensory detail that's in your immediate environment. It's like right there. It's, like behind you, there are these beautiful glass doors, I think, that are right behind you there.
Yes.
I mean, so I'm looking at these glass doors, I'm thinking metaphor. I mean, sort of like seeing, what do we see through windows and stuff like that? And those glass doors are right there in your environment. So yes, just look around you. What are you smelling? What are you seeing? What are you kind of metaphorically tasting or smell? I mean, just that's where we look for our tangible sensory details. And it's those sensory details that we convey in such a way that become metaphors.
So you talk about metaphor, and you also share writing prompts of how to kind of come up with thoughts and images and things to write about throughout, which I think is really helpful as well. So I talked about language and different words. So you talk about the concept of, and I hope I'm saying it right, Sue, tumbarumba, which is the Australian term for to miss, which is an experimental form, and Greek for to cut or to put into a word into two parts and insert another between the halves. And so the idea that you say, and it's sort of like you came up with this concept, is if an essay is maybe not working, maybe put it within another essay. And I love that, because I had an essay that I've had for years, since my daughter was 5 years old. She's 14 now, and it didn't work by itself. And so I'm thinking now of doing it into another essay. So I'm thinking of employing Tumbarumba, if I'm saying it correctly.
Yeah.
We're almost out of time, but I want to just ask you, one of the things you talk about as well is what to do if you want to create an essay collection as opposed to memoir. And you go through all the steps, which is just so helpful. But what is the difference? Like, why would something work better as an essay collection rather than as a memoir?
So with my first two books are memoirs, and basically that means they have like a straight through narrative arc. It's sort of one extended action. I mean, time moves forward and all of that,
Yeah.
but it's all around. The first one is about growing up in my incestuous family. The second is about 28 days I spent in rehab. Then the next two books are essay collections. And I did not have like a straight through kind of narrative arc for either of those, like in How to Survive Death and Other Inconveniences. So I'm terrified of death and all of that. And I do really want to survive it. But there's no like big overall narrative arc about it. So what I did is that, so for an essay collection, you have a thematic center that's sort of holding the whole thing together. So the thematic center to this essay collection is this narrator's fear of death and sort of how narrator started feeling this way and all of that. So you have to have like a thematic core to it. But then you can approach that thematic core, like around the fear of death, through lots of different actions and metaphors and details. So in fact, this book is in 3 parts. And, one part is about sort of the origin of the fear of death. Another part is sort of more about the more kind of emotional or spiritual forms of death that we might experience, maybe particularly women who have been sexually assaulted or going through divorce or addiction. And then just ways to sort of kind of near death things, physical problems that I've had, stuff like that. So it's really just approaching this theme that's holding it all together. It's approaching this theme from all these different angles. So with each essay, you're sort of turning the lens of the camera a little bit and looking at the theme from this direction, that direction. And so that's really what makes an essay collection, is just approaching your theme from different angles. So it can give you a lot of flexibility, really. You don't have to sort of sustain one straight through narrative arc. You can just keep sort of dropping in on this theme from different angles.
Fascinating. Sue, what do you want people to most take away from your book?
It's probably what we did touch on earlier, that everybody really does have a story to tell, and to know that your narrative is important and it's just as important as anybody else's. And the other thing is that if you don't tell your story, if you don't write your narrative, nobody else will. And that's really sad, because then your story is just lost forever. So believe in yourself, believe that your narrative is important, believe that your voice is important, and write it.
Oh, I'm going to end on that. Sue, it has been, wow, it's been such a pleasure talking with you. And I thank you so much for being my guest.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I've loved talking to you. This has been great. So thank you.
Follow me at EstelleSErasmus.com on my website and on social media, which is Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at Estelle S. Erasmus. And we're now on YouTube for Freelance Writing Direct. Follow along, and soon everyone will be reading what you're writing.